This is Monica Perez, and we are on chapter 11 of Makers of the Modern Mind by Thomas P. Neal. This is the chapter on Marx, and the subtitle is The Robot Dirties His Hands. So I don't get it, and I think I've read this book like 3 times already. I didn't read it cover to cover. I just take little pieces of it so I can, like when I talked a little bit to Greg Carlwood on Higher Side Chats about this, and so I had to like read every chapter, or, like find stuff, and we talked about it for like 1 minute. Oh, however, I am going to talk with Scott and William about the entire thing at length, and I just really want to get their opinion on it. I know I've mentioned this before, but that's coming up in May. I'm super excited. So I do some stuff, some premium stuff. I've been doing movie reviews with Scott and Bobby, my producer. That's very fun. I always have the highlight reels. If you want to support me on Substack, I don't even ask people to support me, but I'm starting to ramp back up, and I would love to be able to be clearly in the black on this show. And I think it's worth it. No commercials, live, free content and some bonus material. So check it out on Substack, or if you just want to press subscribe on iTunes, it's cheaper. You don't get the posts and everything, but you do get just a commercial-free feed. I totally get money out of that too. And I also get money out of the commercials. So thank you very much for listening, and for listening through the commercials. We are breaking even here at the Monica Perez Show, and that's really all it takes. Hey, Jack. Yes, we did a show with Anthony Raimundo this morning, so Jack was here for that as well. Anyway, so let's check this book out. It is Marx. After this, it's Marx, and I believe I think Freud is in here. Did we do Freud? I read the Freud one. Not a fan. Well, Freud can't have been before Darwin. Yeah. Marx, Freud, and then Dewey. So Freud is every man his own slave, and Dewey is teachers as social engineers. Well, he certainly got his way. All right, guys. Let's hit it. On St. Patrick's Day of 1883, when Karl Marx was buried in Highgate Cemetery near London, his name was hardly known outside communist circles. So in the eulogy Friedrich Engels delivered at his friend's grave, he tried to show Marx important by coupling his name with Darwin's. Quote, just as Darwin discovered the law of evolution in organic nature, Engels told the small group at the grave, so Marx discovered the law of evolution in human history. The comparison was happy because Marx liked to think of himself as the Darwin of the social sciences, and to believe that Darwin's theory of evolution supported his own class struggle view of history. Marx was a typical 19th century intellectual who thought that Darwin's theory was both respectable and irrefutable, that any body of thought which could be linked to it would thereby become scientific and unanswerable. For many years, indeed, Darwin and Marx lived within an hour's journey of each other. Although he never met Darwin, Marx regarded the famed naturalist as a great man, a great scientist, a great revolutionist. His son-in-law, Aveling, tells us how Marx studiously read each of Darwin's writings as it came off the press, how he wanted to dedicate Das Kapital to Darwin, how he sent an autographed copy of it to him, and how Darwin answered with a polite little bourgeois note in which he remarked, quote, though our studies have been so different, I believe that we both earnestly desire the extension of knowledge, and this in the long run is sure to add to the happiness of mankind. I don't even get that connection. Adding isn't like the entire Adam and Eve about the tree of knowledge really being the fall of man. I'm not saying I don't like my knowledge. I'm a little bit of a knowledge junkie. However, I don't think it's inevitable. Marxists refuse to admit that their studies are so different, quote, as Darwin believed. They frequently point out how the one substantiates the other, how natural science is the solid foundation of both Darwinism and Marxism, how both are coldly scientific in all respects, how both are brilliant objective reports on inevitable trends. Most important, they believe both are, quote, dialectic in orientation and are therefore opposed to the, quote, formal logic of bourgeois thinkers. You can say that again. They go on to indicate that the variations in the method of production brought about by new inventions are shown by Marx to correspond to the biological variations of Darwin. So compatible do Marxists consider Darwinian and Marxian thought that Russian followers of Karl Marx have made Darwinism part of the official teaching in all Russian schools. All right. That's when you realize this was written in 1958, because yes, Darwin is definitely in all of our schools. Even though they epigeneticists know it's wrong. I think, as far as I know, they do. It is true that Marxism and Darwinism possess certain similarities. Both offer a dynamic evolutionary explanation of their respective phenomena in contrast to former static views. Both claim to be scientific. Both are materialistic, and both constitute complete syntheses compiled by systematizers who try to provide the ultimate solution to all problems in their respective fields. Both rest their cases upon man's inescapable struggle for survival, and both therefore presume to be analytical in a hard, realistic way. Both are strongly flavored by their age. They smack of Cavour and Bismarck, or the blood and iron by which all things are done. They fit in nicely with the realism which the late 19th century exhibited in all fields of activity. By the middle of the century, a new self-conscious class had come into being in Europe, the proletariat, a propertyless class created by the factory system, who were the disinherited of the earth. They were the men who sweated and toiled in the factories, who froze and starved in their tenements, who had no homes or gardens, no possession but their precarious jobs. Wait, I thought if you owned nothing, you were happy. What? They were a class who suffered mutely because they had no voice. They sorely needed a prophet. And Marx proposed, like his fathers of the Old Testament, to be their prophet. He must speak the language of the century, however, if he would be a successful prophet. If he wanted to be heard, he must use the magic words of science. He must be realistic and hard. He must consider struggle and violence as inevitable. He must be thoroughly materialistic. He must, in short, be the Darwin of the social sciences, if he would command the respectful ear of Europe in Darwin's day. But he must be more than a scientist. He must become a prophet who has vision in his eye and fire in his nostrils, who enkindles the hearts of his followers by offering them a glimpse of the promised land and lashes out hotly at their oppressors. Marx was the man for the job, a man who was both scientist and prophet, erudite and demagogue, scholar and pamphleteer. He was a sentimentalist at heart, a man of deep passion and strong feeling who hated with a vindictive, unslakable hatred because his heart had been so torn by the sufferings of the wage earner. Marx was the Rousseau of the proletariat, where Rousseau was the prophet of the bourgeoisie. Marx was the prophet of the masses, where Rousseau hated the privileges of the nobility with a raw hatred. Marx hated the bourgeoisie with red, vicious hatred. As Rousseau justified the covetousness of the bourgeoisie and made a moral issue of its being satisfied, so Marx gave the masses a religion with a creed, a Bible, a code, a mission, and a promised land, which justified their demand for a share in the spoils of the Industrial Revolution. Marx was basically a prophet, much closer to Rousseau than to Darwin. Good prophets, both he and Rousseau, held forth ideals which were not too critically examined because of the powerful protests each made. Each, like a good prophet, put together a doctrine which simply was not subject to refutation. Where Rousseau found his truth through feeling rather than reason and could therefore not be answered, Marx found his truth through dialectical reasoning, and one who criticized him simply was not thinking dialectically. So Marx had the soul of a Rousseau, which is necessary for the leader of a powerful protest movement at any time in history. but he wore the intellectual apparel of a Darwin, which was necessary for anyone who would win acceptance in the late 19th century. The secret of his success lies then in having Rousseau's passion and in using Darwin's language, in being a prophet who preached scientifically, in quotes. Marx was more successful than his contemporaries could have imagined he would be. The Weimar Republic of post-war Germany is partly his child, and he is intellectual father of Soviet Russia. He made the European world conscious of the proletariat, and in this way, he pushed governments everywhere to adopt various kinds of, quote, socialist or paternalistic legislation, such as old age pensions, unemployment insurance. That was Bismarck. Did I ever tell you this about Bismarck? The Kaiser was saying, like, we're losing them. We're losing the people. They don't love me anymore after they started to profit from the Industrial Revolution. I mean, we hear about how terrible it was, terrible. I'm not sure it was totally terrible all the time. Why did those people leave their farms? I wonder. Anyway, Bismarck said, well, tax the surplus out of them and give it back to them later, and they'll love you. And we've been living that ever since. Maximum hour and minimum wage laws and safety regulations for industry. He is important because in his hands, socialism acquired a philosophy and became a religion. So all that stuff, what was it? Old age pensions, unemployment insurance, maximum hour, minimum wage laws, safety regulations for industry. That, in my opinion, is there the way like rating systems were there for movies. They were there because if they weren't there, or like the FDA, if they're not there, people will reject the whole thing. They'll take matters into their own hands and say, I don't believe your advertising. I'm not going into your movie theaters. I'm not taking your drugs. So they have to have these apparatuses, this regulation to have people accept the system. If you had, I still think that without any of this, you have a raw competitiveness that creates that race to zero, to economic zero, where there will be new entrants into the market. People will just start their own little businesses. Factories have, I mean, it's been a long time, but factories have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller to where you have plastic printers and job shops and everything. You, over time, which would be a painful amount of time, you would have the free market would take care of this stuff. But regardless, I don't believe that this stuff was put in there at all because of some one guy's compassion. It was definitely there, I think, to maintain the system in the face of true revolt. I mean, do you ever read the Anthony Sutton stuff about the Bolsheviks and what are the names of his books? It's like the Nazis, the Bolsheviks, and like it's big business or capitalism or something. I'll find it. But hey, I bet somebody can find out. Yeah, what were the Anthony Sutton books? Like the something and the Bolsheviks, the something and the Nazis. Let me know, please. All right. Anyway, he is important because in his hands, Marx is important because in his hands, socialism acquired a philosophy and became a religion. Though his classless society is as far from realization today as it was in 1883, Marx has nevertheless made his imprint on Western civilization. Though Marx's conclusions in history and economics are now discredited, historians write as they do today because of Karl Marx. Politicians devise the legislation they do in many countries because of him. Class hatreds are as bitter as they are because of him. For better and for worse, Marx is still very much with us. What his ultimate effect on the Western world will be, we still cannot say. This is 58. For the children of Karl Marx are fighting today to make his dream of world revolution come true. But of his paramount importance, we can have no doubt. Okay, that was the intro to Marx. We're about to start on section 1. By the end of the 20th century, I noticed that we didn't talk about, like, socialism was kind of dead. It was actually straight through to Obama. And the 21st century dialectic they were going for, in my opinion, and they still are, is like secular human or whatever, Western civilization versus Islamic civilization, so that you can have a merger and have a Sharia law, a secular Sharia law. That's what I think the real 21st century dialectic is. But that one wasn't as juicy, wasn't as powerful as capitalism versus communism. So they rolled back reintroduced capitalism versus communism to us. But it's not a real struggle. It's all an absolute stage play. However, the rhetoric was awesome, and we must have developed like archetypal forms for this stuff because it totally resonated with these dare I say, our dumb kids. Whoops. I missed that. Sorry, Quest. Okay. 1. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, a cosmopolitan town in the Rhineland. German in speech, but largely French in culture. Yes, Cologne or Cologne. His parents were Jewish, but when Karl was 6, they joined the National Evangelical Church, and the children were educated as Protestants in this overwhelmingly Catholic community. The oldest son of a respectable middle-class family, Karl found that great things were expected of him. His father had selected him as the son to be educated, the child chosen to make a place for himself in the world. This responsibility weighed heavily on him throughout his early years. Combined with a pressing consciousness of his Jewish origin, it apparently developed in him that feeling of inferiority which lies at the basis of his abnormal personality. Although he had proved only a moderately successful student in his preparatory work, his father nevertheless sent him to the university at Bonn in 1835. There, in his daughter's words, to please his father, he for a time studied law, and to please himself, he studied history and philosophy. At Bonn, young Karl Marx showed tremendous but ill-directed strength. He wrote to his father, for example, telling how all at the same time he was writing 3 volumes of poetry to his fiancée, translating large sections of Tacitus and Ovid, writing a book on the philosophy of law, composing a play, learning Hegel from beginning to end, and meanwhile reading books on diverse subjects. And that guy had a girlfriend? You buying that? This was a time, of course, when there was intense intellectual activity in the German universities. Intellectually, they were far ahead of the rest of Europe, but politically and economically, they were still under Metternich's strong hand. And as a result, the students were inclined toward revolution of any kind. Marx studied at 2 universities, Bonn and Berlin, and got his doctorate by mail from a third, Jena, then notorious for the laxness with which it granted degrees. So I guess online learning, like, the University of Phoenix, basically, I guess. Which, so what? That's fine. By 1842, he was ready to return to Bonn as a lecturer in philosophy, but instead he became editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, and thus began his career of revolutionary agitation. Nobody found my Anthony Sutton thing? Hold on a minute. I cannot find it. All right, I'm going to Google it. Sorry. Hold on, people. Hopefully, Bobby will cut this out for the audio. Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. That's the name. And I think the other ones are Wall Street and the Nazis. Yada, yada, yada. Okay. So, yes. All right. The next 7 years were a period of enforced wandering for the young journalist and his noble-born wife, Jenny Westphalen, whom he had married in 1842. He was 24. The couple went to Paris in 1843 when Marx's paper was suppressed. There he met Friedrich Engels, who was finishing his study on the condition of the working class in England. And the 2 men began a 40-year friendship and a collaboration which was to prove most effective for the communist movement. Engels was primarily a man of action and a pamphleteer. Marx was primarily a theorist and a library recluse. Engels was inclined to science, Marx to philosophy and history. Engels' father had money on which both he and Marx could live. Marx was socially a helpless individual who could never have survived had it not been for his friend's generosity. Like, what was he supposed to do? Like, what did all these guys do who were dead ass broke? Excuse me. And went to university and they were ne'er-do-wells and want to get married, but like, God forbid they work. Like, there's still people like that in Europe. Like, I'm sure I told you this. I had a friend who was a money manager, like a private money guy, and he was talking to some, Italian count or something. And the guy said, "You don't understand. If you don't turn this around, somebody in my family is going to have to work." I'm like, uh, but I don't understand what this guy was supposed to do. They live in destitution rather than work. But I don't even know what job they were supposed to get. Shopkeeper? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I guess once you're landless, I'm sure somebody knows the answer. Okay. The first fruit of their collaboration was The Holy Family, written in 1844 against Bruno Bauer and other young Hegelians, then prominent in the German universities. I think that sounds like a good band name. The Young Hegelians. I like it. In 1845, Marx was expelled from France by the Guizot government, so he went to Brussels. There, he wrote such things as his essay on free trade and his Poverty of Philosophy. Maybe it was about how much it sucks to be broke and not be willing to work. More important for the communist movement, however, he and Engels founded the German Workers' Association in 1846. Which they associated with the Communist League in the next year. They were commissioned by the League to draw up a program of party principles, the formulation of which appeared in 1848 as the famous Communist Manifesto, written chiefly by Marx, it seems, but officially produced by their joint authorship. In 1848, revolution broke out in Paris, and soon it was spreading all over Europe. When it threatened Brussels, Marx was asked to leave Belgium. He returned for a short time to Paris to witness events in that capital of revolution. From there, he went to Cologne to establish the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which was suppressed in the spring of the following year. Again, Marx went to Paris. Again, he was asked to leave. And this time he went to London for a few months, quote. But the few months dragged on until his death in 1883. For the last 34 years of his life, he enjoyed the comparatively tranquil life of a political refugee in that home of exiled revolutionists and deposed monarchs. He devoted the rest of his lifetime to a scholarly formulation of communist theory, to planning a program of action, to stirring up workers to prepare themselves for the great day of revolution which lay ahead. The year of 1848 is therefore the dividing point in Marx's life. Before then, and especially through that year of revolution, he lived in excited, momentary expectation of revolution to put the proletariat in power throughout Europe. Like, really? Who thought that would be a good idea? Like, somebody's ready to take up the reins when that happens. Somebody who would depose monarchs everywhere, no doubt. But the failure of revolutions everywhere, from street fighting in Vienna and Berlin and Paris to the Chartist fiasco in London, convinced him by the end of 1848 that careful planning was needed, that the proletariat had to be schooled in revolutionary technique, that the bourgeois state was not yet ripe and soft enough to fall. He therefore settled down to long-term planning and to the creation of a body of doctrine which would both instruct and inspire his followers. The vanguard of the proletariat. Marx the agitator became Marx the scholar after 1848, but he never fully quenched the agitator in his makeup. At first, Marx's life in London was dreary, miserable, wretched. His family lived in squalid poverty until the middle 50s, for which Marx's wife deserves more sympathy and earns more admiration than he. All but 3 of his children died in these years of disease. Wow. Holy cow. Consequent upon their poverty, a fact which aroused fierce resentment and a sense of helpless despair in Marx's heart. I just want to say it one more time. Get a job. Drive an Uber, for crying out loud. Metaphorically speaking. His family lived in 2 rooms in Dean Street, Soho, where Marx devoted himself entirely to study and writing, while his children starved to death, by the by. Okay, he earned a pittance by sending articles to the New York Tribune, but his chief source of income consisted of remittances from Engels. These were never as much as Marx needed, because Engels' father was the tight-fisted kind of capitalist whom Marx so furiously berates. And he's supporting Marx and doesn't really know it, but he's tight-fisted. And by the way, Marx is calling him tight-fisted for not supporting him while he doesn't work and doesn't contribute with art. He contributes with pathos. So for several years, Marx's life was a continual bout with hunger and bill collectors, with disease and dunners, cold and lawyers. After the middle 50s, Marx was not so desperately poor, and after 1869, when Engels paid up his debts and settled a comfortable income on him, he had no difficulty living the life of a moderately well-fixed bourgeois pensioner. Finally. Through disease and poverty and the noise of squalling children, maybe partly to escape them, Marx spent every day deep in research in the British Museum. There he amassed the information he was to put in Das Kapital. There he followed the Kant-like routine for which 19th century German PhDs became notorious. Meanwhile, he turned his pen to pamphleteering whenever the occasion presented itself. Essays which appear as bright red spots in the long gray stretch of his economic Wissenschaft. In 1859, he published his first notable piece of scholarship, The Critique of Political Economy. And in 1867, the first volume of Kapital appeared. Some years later, the second volume appeared, but the third was still a jumble of notes when he died, and Engels put them together to make the posthumous third volume. Marx's life at London was not devoted to scholarship alone. He was also active in promoting communist theory among the working men of London. This activity led to the establishment of the First International in 1864, when Marx attended a meeting at St. Martin's Hall on behalf of Poles who were then revolting from Russian rule. A proposal was made at this meeting for the founding of an international working men's association, which, as the first international, was the body through which Marx's spirit found expression. Although he was officially only corresponding secretary for Germany and Russia in the International, Marx was the leading spirit in all general councils, the author of almost all documents and addresses it issued, from the inaugural address of 1864 down to the dissolution of the International after the fall of the Paris Commune in 1871. Internal difficulties, chiefly with the anarchists led by Bakunin, combined with the odium cast upon the International by the extremism of the Paris insurrection of 1871, made advisable the suspension of the body's activity and the transferal of a skeleton organization to New York. You know what I would find very interesting? How many other people did Engels support? So this is my theory of many are called, but few are chosen, like conjuring Hitler, that idea that you just, or it was like a thing, you heard Harry Reid, like they want, America's ready for a light skin. I think he said like a light-skinned black president without an accent, something crazy like that. But guys like that, I think set up, this is the rumor anyway, set up mayors, black mayors to draw from and just wanted to see how they did. And then like some like Fitzpatrick or Kirkpatrick or whatever don't do so well. Deval Patrick, he did well. I think his name is Deval. So I think there's a many are called, few are chosen thing. And I just wonder what the stable of communist writers Engels used to find this guy. All right. When Marx died in 1883, therefore, he was apparently a failure. or who was behind Engels, doing it to Engels and others. Okay. The communist revolution had not come, as he had prophesied it would, either in England or in Germany. The optimistic note sounded in the Communist Manifesto and in subsequent addresses must have mocked this prophet of the proletariat if he recalled those writings in his last days. But his followers, who were for a time few in number, had great faith in the movement, a faith which had been made possible by Marx's unique fusing of pseudo-scientific scholarship with missionary zeal, a faith which cannot be disassociated from Marx the man. For communists have universally treated him with the respect reserved for a messiah of the proletarian covenant, the prophet who, after the manner of Moses, provided his followers a glimpse of the promised land and put a roadmap in their hands so that they could not lose their way. Marx has thus been made the symbol of a movement that is much bigger than either Marx or his theory. Section 2. It is important then to see what sort of person Karl Marx was, and it is as difficult as it is necessary. It is difficult because Marx has been treated either as a diabolically inspired, bewhiskered Jew who plotted the downfall of civilization, or as a lovable saint who selflessly devoted himself to the betterment of the downtrodden. Marx was neither the one nor the other, though he sometimes seems to be both. It is necessary to know the man, because Marxian doctrine is made up of scattered sentences and paragraphs that the reader must cull from Marx's various voluminous writings, only half of which have ever even been published. And the reader can cull more intelligently when he knows the man who is always saying more or less than he means. Marx was one man to his family, another to the world. He spent Sunday with his wife and daughters going to Hampstead Heath for a picnic or playing family games and entertaining close associates at home. He seems, from all descriptions, to have been a lovable, devoted father who could create a wondrous fairy tale at command, or be very serious playing such a game as Confession with his daughters, or be an omnibus for his favorite grandson, or an amateurish declaimer of Shakespeare on the walk home from Hampstead Heath. The Marx who was ridden as an omnibus is not the same man who wrote the Communist Manifesto or penned vitriolic calumny against Bakunin. There were two Marxes, in fact, and the family Marx was a lovable, rather helpless head of the family who was a lot of fun when he could be dragged out of his study. I'm kind of mad at him for not feeding his children, though. Anyway, he was very much like an industrial tycoon playing with his grandson's electric train under the family Christmas tree. To the world, Marx was quite a different man. Janus-like, he reveals two faces to the world. At one time, he is a student deep in the archives of the British Museum, analyzing contemporary capitalism. At other times, that's kind of interesting. What do you think it was like back then? Like, it had to have been more overt than it is now. And my problem with capitalism is that it exploits the government to restrain competition. That's the problem with it, in my opinion. It's the regulation. I can't get away from that. I'm sorry. I don't have to be a hardcore anarcho-capitalist anymore because obviously, a lot of this has been a setup. But I do think the problem is the regulations anyway. At other times, he is an incendiary pamphleteer, a street corner demagogue who glories in arousing the passion of his listeners. Paul Lafargue, spelled Lafargue, his secretary and son-in-law, therefore warns us that, quote, we shall never understand him unless we contemplate him simultaneously as man of science and as socialist fighter. Marx did not keep these two personalities nicely separated. Soapbox invective slips into his most learned dissertations, and German Wissenschaft parades learnedly in his platform utterances and his call to action pamphlets. Both as demagogue and as scholar, however, Marx was hostile to all the world beyond the rim of his family circle. Karl Marx had no real friends. He was at ease with his family, with faithful Lenchen the maid, and with such followers as were willing to sit worshipfully at his feet, burning their incense of adoration to this super brain. Even Engels was more a willing man Friday than a real friend or equal. Karl Schurz voiced the opinion of almost everyone who tried to meet Marx on a plane of equality when he observes of him, I have never seen a man whose bearing was so provoking and intolerable. To no opinion which he differed from his own did he accord the honor of even condescending consideration. Every argument that he did not like, he answered either with biting scorn at the unfathomable ignorance that prompted it, or opprobrious aspersions upon the motives of him who had advanced it. It was a quote. Bakunin had personal reasons for describing Marx as, quote, immensely malicious, vain, quarrelsome, as intolerant and autocratic as Jehovah, the God of his fathers, small g. Bakunin, please. And like him, insanely vindictive. There is no lie, no calumny, which he is not capable of using against anyone who has incurred his jealousy or his hatred. He will not stop at the basest intrigue if, in his opinion, it will serve to increase his position, his influence, and his power. End quote. Sounds like Carrie Mullis talking about Anthony Fauci, like honestly. While Marx was reading in the British Museum, a young physician in Vienna was making observations which today throw some light on Marx's abnormal personality. Certainly, he suffered from a gnawing feeling of inferiority. There's no other way to account for, quote, Daddy Marx's lovable dealing with children and worshipful followers, whereas he was so irritable and quarrelsome and aspersive with all rivals or opponents. This feeling of inferiority was doubtlessly intensified by constant reference to his Jewish origin. That's probably true. Did you ever read Albert J. Nock? It's it seemed like it was totally fine to just make fun of people for being Jewish. His frequent diatribes against, I don't think it's like as vicious as it is now, but I can imagine that would suck. His frequent diatribes against Judaism showed his shame of being Jewish and his unsuccessful attempt to dissociate himself from his race. His failure to achieve the early striking success he knew his father expected of him probably deepened this sense of inferiority. Marx therefore matured a terribly self-centered personality with a deep sense of inferiority, which made him abnormally quarrelsome, unduly aggressive, unjustifiably suspicious, thoroughly ungrateful. He made too much of his own sufferings. He found no thought processes but his own deserving of examination or discussion. His correspondence with Engels reveals how self-centered, how ungrateful he could be. Boy, Jack got this like 15 minutes ago. Jack said this dude must have been insufferable in real life. Apparently he was. That's a good one because that's what is being unfolded before us. And don't you know people like that? They're just, it's so astonishingly self-centered. Like, it's like, what? There's actually a therapy for that, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which is really funny because this guy exploits the dialectic, and it's meant to get you to see other people's point of view. And it's actually useful, I think, for anybody because you do see more from your point of view than from others. But I think it sounds like he's one of the kind of people who doesn't even realize some other people have a point of view. Marx answered Engels' letter telling of his mistress's death, for example, by just hold the phone. This guy did all that stuff. His children were starving to death. He married this fancy chick and he had a mistress? What? Oh, okay. Engel had the mistress. Okay. I mean, the mistress is definitely for the rich guys. I mean, come on. Okay. But okay. Marx answered Engels' letter yes, Quest is like ahead of me. You guys, I've got such a smart audience. Marx answered Engels' letter telling of his mistress's death, for example, by dismissing his friend's loss in a sentence and then filling the remainder of the letter with the usual list of lamentations. Yeah, what a jerk. bills unpaid, threatened actions at law by his creditors, sickness at home, bad weather, and on with all those griefs experienced by so many households. Marx seemed to think no one but he ever suffered, for he was incapable of thinking, except in the abstract, about anyone but Karl Marx. Okay. I wonder if we're going to get to this. Flazignon. I know I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But Marx knocked up the maid. I think that's a spoiler. I think you're scooping us, Flays. JC says Marxists believe women are public property. I've heard that, and it's so weird because I haven't heard exactly like that. If you want to explain more, it's helpful to me. But I've heard that. But but it's in such contrast to how they present themselves, like comrade. They don't even have Ms. They just went full comrade. So I don't know if they treated women worse, but I have heard that. Okay. Marx's aim in life after 1848 was to become the scientist of world revolution. Like Bentham and Ricardo, Marx believed that social relationships can be reduced to numbers and equations, to ratios and abstract quantities, which are more real than men and machines. In the preface to his critique of political economy, he tells us that economic phenomena, quote, can be watched and recorded with the precision proper to natural science. I mean, things that are transacted in money can be counted, but that might be as far as I'm willing to go. Engels tells us even more specifically how the communist sociology is to be made an exact science. Quote, with the same certainty with which from a given mathematical proposition a new one is deduced, with that same certainty can we deduce the social revolution from the existing social conditions and the principles of political economy. Marx and Engels frequently stated that a science, even their social science, was perfect only when it could be expressed in mathematical terms. A purely scientific attack is therefore needed on those social and economic problems. And Marx thinks he is purely scientific. His repeated references to the work of the physicist, the chemist, the biologist show how he looked upon himself as a Darwin who had scientifically arrived at the foundations of his new body of knowledge. Of course, he picks Darwin. Darwin didn't prove anything. He was great, he believed, and he differed from all other socialists because he had scientifically analyzed capitalist society and discovered its laws of operation. The other socialists had dreamed wishfully of pie in the sky, whereas he had examined society as a mechanic examines an engine to discover how the goal of socialism was to be realized out of the existing materials of capitalism. I have to indulge in this additional aside. Have you ever seen the skeleton of a whale? Like, their fins are hands. They came from the land into the ocean. Like, I have to say, there do appear to be evolutionary impulses, but it was Lamarck. I highly recommend The Case of the Midwife Toad. I should I read this or should I read? I can't even find it now. The Servando Gonzalez one that I want to read. I really want to read that, but this is so short. I don't know. We'll decide later. Okay. Where was I? Okay. But Marx never pretended to be objective, like a scientist working in his laboratory. That he did not do. Lenin is a good Marxist when he tells the reader that objectivity is rather stupidly naive and that an impartial social science is impossible in a society founded on class struggle. Lenin is probably right in this latter claim, but he and other Marxists are wrong in claiming that Marx was both scientific and partial. Still, Marx would have it so. He had arrived at the position through his German philosophy that knowledge cannot be objective, that knowing consists not merely in absorbing factual information, but in altering it in the process. He could therefore logically maintain that he was both subjective and scientific, that what he said was proletarian truth, which at his moment in history was universal truth. I don't understand how these subjectivists explain Level and Plum. So, no. So Marx considered himself, quote, scientific in all his writings, even though they are polemical rather than objective. Everything Marx wrote, as a matter of fact, was directed against some individual or some school. Everything he wrote finds him overstating the point at issue, saying more than he means. The reader who would understand Marx must keep this point in mind. Otherwise, by taking each statement literally at face value, he will have Marx even a worse bundle of contradictions than he really is. He overstates his materialism, for example, against Bruno Bauer's idealism. He overstates his principle of reciprocity and activity against Feuerbach's passive materialism. He overemphasizes the principle of authority against the anarchists. Against the classical economists, he insists on historical relationships. Against the historical economists, he insists on the analytical method. Against the fatalists, he insists that human beings make their own history. Against the individualists, he insists that everything is determined by the method of production. Emphasizing now one point, now another, Marx contradicts himself constantly. Sometimes he contradicts himself within 2 or 3 pages of a single pamphlet, and occasionally he reverses himself within a single paragraph. Consistency is not one of Marx's virtues. For that reason, it is difficult to evaluate either the man or his thought. He was at bottom a sentimentalist nursing an inferiority complex, which helps account for his being a loving father at home, Daddy Marx, to the neighborhood children, a benevolent old man to worshipful young followers. It also accounts for the coarse abuse, the puerile sarcasm, the malevolent imputations of vice with which he treated all opponents. Sentimentalists love ardently and hate fiercely because they feel intensely. Sounds like Rousseau, right? Because Marx never gave up Hegel's method of, quote, thinking in the dialectic, and because he approached economic questions from the evolutionary point of view, he could consistently be inconsistent. Marx could be all these contradictory things and, like Rousseau, be quite satisfied with himself. He must be taken in one piece as pseudoscientist and demagogue, as soft sentimentalist and vitriolic hater, as missioner who bitterly condemned force used by the bourgeois state but exulted in violence used by the proletariat. Marx was all these things at once. And because he was all these things, he became the voice of the proletariat, a class that was easily moved, that at this time could not help having a social inferiority complex, and that under such circumstances could more readily be roused to bitter antagonism. But a class that, like Marx himself, accepted much more of 19th century bourgeois attitudes and standards, beliefs and judgments than it ever knew. Yeah, this is a good point Quest makes. I wouldn't doubt Marx could figure out the problems, not so much the solutions. And of course, that's the game. That's what happened in the 60s. They talked about the problems. They tore away all of the structures in society, and they solved none of the problems at all. They didn't want to. And they created many more and tore away many good things. I wrote that article about The Odd Couple, which I still like and kind of explains that. Yes, that came to my mind too. Ignatius J. Riley from Confederacy of Dunces is Marx. I didn't realize that strictly. If was it really supposed to be a metaphor, because it did remind me of that. All right, we are on section 3. All right, this is a slightly longer chapter than the others, so we might go a little longer. Analysts of Marxian theory almost always explain it as a blend of Hegelian philosophy and English economics. The Hegelians were collectivists. These critics argue, and their method was historical, whereas the English were individualists, and their method was analytical. The combination of these two outlooks and these two methods, they conclude, made for scientific socialism. Marx, as the author of Das Kapital, can be explained on these grounds, but this explanation does not hold for Marx as the author of the Communist Manifesto and the leader of the Communist Party. Lenin adds a third source of Marxism to German philosophy and English economics. This is the radical French socialism, which Marx came to view closely in the 1840s, which he saw fail under Louis Blanc to seize control of France in 1848. Lenin thus gives a fuller picture of Marxism, one which is better rounded and better shaded than if the French socialist element is left out. Even Lenin's picture, however, is not complete enough to account for Marx's unique success in putting together a body of doctrine which somehow caught on when other similar attempts by equally intelligent socialists failed. I would say that's where Anthony Sutton comes in. Marx was successful because he caught the temper of his time as no other socialist had done. Evolution in one form or another was in the air. It was propounded in Hegelian philosophy and in Darwinian science, as we have seen. And Marx was therefore in swing with the age when he used it to explain all human history and all social arrangements. It was a materialistic age, and Marx was only stating generally assumed but not yet loudly shouted beliefs when he propounded his dogmatic, thoroughgoing materialism. Realism was the pervading keynote of the age, a ruthless realism which preached to those who were physically and morally strong that they were duty-bound to trample their competitors. In international affairs, it was called realpolitik. In economics, it was competition. I was just supporting that, and I kind of stand by it. In biology, it was struggle for existence. But you have to have competition. You have to be fair. You have to have morality. You have to not lie to people. Arm's length transactions, okay. But lying and fraud and stuff, yes, this should be illegal and immoral. In philosophy, it was the will to survive and the will to power. And now in his explanation of man's social history, Marx explained it as class struggle, a term which 19th century intellectuals were ready to accept without question. So Marx spoke the language of his time and accepted uncritically many assumptions of the age, a secret of wide reception at any time in history. He was much more a 19th century bourgeois than he knew or than Marxists will admit today. Principal ingredients of his system, however, are undoubtedly Hegelian philosophy and British classical economics, to which he added the socialist conclusions of such predecessors as Owen and Fourier, Saint-Simon, and Sismondi. From Hegel, he obtained the dialectic, which is an explanation of the laws by which history operates. Hegel was an idealist, of course, who insisted that the ultimate realities moving through history are ideas, that material things are only a manifestation of basic reality, the idea. Hegel differed from the earlier idealists in holding that ideas are not static, that they are in a state of fluid logical development. This, he held, was true both of particular ideas and of the great idea, whose struggle towards self-realization through the dialectical process is the essential chord of history. Hegel explained how progress was achieved by this law of logical development. Any idea, by the very nature of things, begets a negation of itself. The combination of the original idea, called the thesis, with its negation, called the antithesis, results in a synthesis, which in turn serves as the thesis when the process begins all over again. The law of movement is therefore to be found within the idea itself. Ideas are, so to speak, self-debating entities that move through history according to laws of logical self-development. And they move in zigzag fashion from thesis to antithesis to synthesis. Well, maybe we should think a little bit more about the 20th century dialectic versus the 21st century. So the 20th, let's say, was communism and capitalism, which he's saying is founded on Hegel and British economics. So they're not really total opposites. Anyway, they, I would say, synthesized to social democracy, whatever. And that's the starting point for the 21st century versus what? Like the church state thing, the Sharia law thing. And then you're going to have a synthesis of that, I think. But anyway, I'll say that they're right and that here we are. I mean, I obviously get the dialectic and it's constant and it's the root of all psyops and all of that. But it is like a meta thing too. Okay. Marx rejected Hegelian idealism before he was 25. but he always adhered to the dialectic as giving the true evolutionary explanation of mankind's social development. It will only be necessary for him to stand Hegel on his feet, to use his own metaphor, and to show that it is not ideas but classes that move through history, that not ideas but things are the ultimate realities in the world, that the self-debating process is dependent upon economic relations and upon the method of production adopted by a given civilization at a given moment in history. Thus, he will show scientifically and conclusively, to the satisfaction of all his followers, that capitalism begets its own negation and brings about its own end because of the inner laws of capitalistic development. Let's see. Whereas Hegel's contribution to Marxism was historical and stressed the collectivity of social groups, the English economist's contribution was analytical and stressed man's individuality. So Hegel was responsible for the collectivity of social groups. The economist was analytical and stressed individuality. Okay, well, that feels like a dialectic in itself. Whereas Hegel made Marx a system builder, Engels and England made him an analytical critic of the capitalist system. Yeah, we're getting a little bit long in the tooth. Say goodbye to some of these folks. Until he met Engels, Marx had been too theoretical. But from that time on, he amassed a world of facts on the working of the factory system, the stuff from which Das Kapital was to be made. But Marx got more than factual information from his English connections. He also accepted the laws propounded by Malthus, Ricardo, and Mill, laws which he was to modify as Hodgkin and Thompson had modified them a quarter of a century earlier. From Malthus, he obtained the notion of struggle for survival, which he converted from a struggle among individuals to a struggle between classes. From Ricardo, he obtained the labor theory of value, from which he naturally deduced a surplus theory of value to justify expropriating the expropriators. From the classical economists, he obtained the practice of looking upon economic activity in highly abstract fashion to create scientific laws that allowed men no leeway to wander and err as human beings are wont to do. Marx's proletarian, in the last analysis, is nothing more than Ricardo's economic man with dirty hands. He is a wage earner who is determined by Marx to follow his selfish, materialistic interests as logically, as intelligently, and as ruthlessly as Ricardo's entrepreneur had followed his interests. Both the economic man of the classical economists and the proletarian of Marx follow the irresistible urge to accumulate doctors as mechanically as a magnet collects iron fillings. Neither Ricardo nor Marx will allow their respective heroes the right to be human beings, to exercise free will, or to make any mistake other than that of miscalculation. Marx differs from the English economists in only one important respect. He replaces their static world of the producer's paradise with his evolutionary, progressive world where everything is fluid, where everything turns into a negation of itself. This was the revolutionary effect of his combining the Hegelian dialectic with the English science of economics. Marx lived in a world where the word socialism was already well known. It was associated, however, with the utopian schemes of such good-hearted men as Robert Owen in England and Saint-Simon, Saint-Simon must be, Fourier, and Cabet in France. All these men had exposed the terrible social results of the Industrial Revolution: poverty and starvation for the workers, disease and cattle-like crowding in the cities, malnutrition and deformation of human cogs in the big machine of industry, hopeless misery and dark despair in all workers' hearts. These utopian socialists had proposed their remedies which differed somewhat with each author, but which all depended on the benevolence of the employing class. Such schemes had been tried by 1848, and they had failed. Nevertheless, the fact remains that they had been proposed, that theoretically they did remedy the worst abuses of capitalism, that their failure seemed to be due chiefly to the method by which they were put into practice. In 1848, moreover, Marx witnessed what he thought was the momentary triumph of workers in almost every capital of Europe, and he witnessed their final failure. By 1848, then, when Marx was 30 years old and when he had decided to become the scientist prophet of the proletariat, he had obtained all the constituent elements of his doctrine. From Germany, he had obtained Hegel's dialectic, which he had placed upon its feet to serve his revolutionary ends. From the English, he had obtained the abstract science of economics. From the French socialists and from personal observation of the revolution of 1848, he had obtained the notion of class struggle and the vision of a happy world where workers were producers enjoying the full fruit of their labor. From all three countries, he had absorbed the atheism, the evolutionism, and the scientism which were in the air. By 1848, Marx had become a truly cosmopolitan figure who could read almost all the leading European languages and could write German, French, and English fluently. By reason of his background and his schooling, his travels, and his experience, he was qualified to be the prophet of a revolution that professed to ignore national lines and to concentrate on class lines instead. So I know this is really an extra long chapter, so I'm going to go ahead and read section 4, and then we'll still have kind of an extra long sesh next time. 4. In his funeral eulogy, Engels told his listeners that Marx made two most important discoveries: the law of historical materialism and the surplus theory of value. I don't remember that. The first epoch-making discovery Engels went on to describe thus, quote, he discovered the simple fact, heretofore hidden beneath ideological overgrowths, that human beings must have food and drink, clothing and shelter, first of all, before they can interest themselves in politics, science, art, religion, and the like. This implies that the production of the immediately requisite material means of subsistence, and therefore therewith the extant economic developmental phase of a nation or an epoch, constitutes the foundation upon which the state institutions, the legal outlooks, the artistic, and even the religious ideas of those concerned have been built up. Marx evolved this theory of history described by Engels by combining two principal ideas: that the units moving through history are economic classes, and that these economic classes, as opposed, I would say, to the Frankfurt School, which realized this isn't working, let's make it race, certainly not individuals anyway, that these classes with their outlooks and their institutions depended ultimately upon the method of production. The first of these ideas is found succinctly stated as the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Not sure about that. Where Hegel made ideas the real units moving through history, Marx substitutes classes. And these classes move in dialectical fashion. They are, by the very nature of things, bound to be in conflict with each other. Each class begets its negation by the method of production it employs. The feudal class, for example, created a bourgeois class. I remember this now from actual economics at Harvard, where the guy was like shocked me by saying Marx considered it when feudalism, capitalism, socialism. Interesting. So I forgot about this. So there was a John Galt Society at Harvard, and I was so pathologically anxious about being there. I was a junior. I knew nobody. I would stammer and stuff. I had problems. I wouldn't go out. I wouldn't talk to anybody. I barely went to classes. But I went to the John Galt Society. I thought I'd probably find some like-minded people there. And they were debating the socialists. And I remember blowing the John Galt people away because I was like, oh yeah, socialism is the next step. That is truly Marx recognized capitalism as a necessary precursor. I think so. You'd build all the factories and then these guys will all come in and steal it. And the John Galt people wanted me so much to come back. And I just had too much of a panic attack. I could never go back again. But he said each class begets its negation by the method of production it employs. Yes. The feudal class, for example, created a bourgeois class of money lenders and commercial people who, because they had no place in feudal society, worked for its overthrow. They were successful at length, and they created their own capitalistic society. By their factory method of production, the capitalists in turn produce a class of wage earners, the proletariat, and the proletarians are bound to work for the overthrow of the capitalists. Speaking of Albert J. Nock, I think he was saying that the founding of this country was really a battle between the agriculturalists, the Patrick Henry guys, and the merchant class, and the merchants won. So the Articles of Confederation was that agriculture and the merchants. So it could be that progression, like that was the critical moment that led us toward the path of socialism, which we absolutely have, sadly. In their struggle for power, these various classes adopt whatever ideas and practices, whatever social or political devices. Oh my gosh. And they use Marxism to overthrow any remaining, to do it like less organically. But, I'm just thinking about the progression of the revolutions, getting rid of the monarchs, and how deliberate it is, though. That's the thing. He says it's organic, and I think it's deliberate. Okay. Although he does say they do want to overthrow. So I guess there is agency. Interesting stuff. In their struggle for power, these various classes adopt whatever ideas and practices, whatever social or political devices will serve as weapons against their antagonists. Religion, law, decent behavior, social etiquette, Marx insists, are all bourgeois inventions for keeping the proletarian in chains. That is why law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. So it is with the government, the army, the police. Political power, Marx explains, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. Marx modestly admits that his predecessors had recognized that men are divided into economic classes which are necessarily in life and death struggle with each other. He claims credit, however, for discovering that the existence of classes is bound up with certain phases of material production. His most specific statement on this point is to be found in the preface to the Critique of Political Economy. There, Marx tells the reader, I was led by my studies to the conclusion that legal relations and the forms of the state could neither be understood by themselves nor be explained by what was called the general progress of the human mind, but were rooted in the material conditions of life. He then proceeds to explain this basis of class struggle in what is perhaps his most noted passage. Quote, in the social production of their subsistence, men enter into determined and necessary relations with each other, which are independent of their wills. Production relations which correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. The sum of these production relations forms the economic structure of society, the real basis upon which a juridical and political superstructure arises, and to which definite social forms of consciousness correspond. The mode of production of the material subsistence conditions the social, political, and spiritual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men which determines their existence, but on the contrary, it is their social existence which determines their consciousness. Everything then is determined by the method of production used at a particular time in history. On it ultimately depend all ideals and all morality, all prejudices and all social groupings, all leisure activity and all cultural pursuits. Men's conceptions, thoughts, spiritual intercourse here still appear as the direct emanation of their material conduct. This is true according to Marxian theory, because the method of production determines the relationship which is established between classes in this basic business of producing wealth. Upon this relationship will depend the class's attitude toward the whole of life. And since men, for Marx, are only automata, who act blindly according to, well, it's what Ayn Rand used to call automatons, who act blindly according to the class label they wear, then everything they do or think or say or dream will be determined by their class membership. The class, moreover, is determined by the method of production. So ultimately, everyone's hopes and desires, pet peeves, and idiosyncrasies are determined by the method of production. In our day, the factory system. So is he saying that everybody within each of those classes are kind of cookie cutter. This is where like that identity politics grew. Engels sums up Marxian theory on this point succinctly. It was seen that all past history, with the exception of its primitive stages, was the history of class struggles, that these warring classes of society are always the products of the modes of production and of exchange. In a word, of the economic conditions of their time, that the economic structure of society always furnishes the real basis, starting from which we can alone work out the ultimate explanation of the whole superstructure of juridical and political institutions, as well as of the religious, philosophical, and other ideas of a given historical period. This is the materialism for which Marx is so widely known and almost as widely misunderstood. He frequently inveighed against contemporary crass materialists who denied the existence of anything but hard, substantial matter. Engels remarked late in life that the materialism commonly imputed to him and Marx was more extreme and simple than was justified. But, he added, it was probably their own fault because of the overstatements they continually made in their polemics against the Hegelian idealists and the utopian socialists. Marxian materialism does not deny the existence of non-material things, but it does make them mere reflections of material realities. On this point, incidentally, Marx is neither consistent nor precise. Sometimes he calls ideals, religion, literature, and art reflections of material things. Sometimes he calls them derivatives. Again, they are superstructures erected upon the economic foundation. Whatever they are, nevertheless, he always insists that they are nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into terms of thought. Another point in Marxian historical materialism on which there is properly much confusion is man's role as a human being. There is confusion among both Marxists and their critics because there was confusion in Marx's own mind. Logically, his system was deterministic. Everything flows inevitably and necessarily from the method of production according to the laws of the dialectic. Actually, Marx seems usually to have thought that history moved independently of men. He constantly uses such terms as necessarily and determined. Occasionally, however, he leaves room for man's role as an undetermined human being who is only conditioned by his environment. In the 18th Brumaire, he writes, "Man makes his own history, but he does not make it out of whole cloth. He does not make it out of conditions chosen by himself, but out of such as he finds close at hand." Engels puts the same idea this way. History proceeds in such a way that the end result always issues from the conflict of many individual wills. For that which each individual desires meets an opposition from every other, and the result is something which nobody desired. Marx simply had to deny his logical determination if he were to stir the proletariat to action. Marx the scientist was deterministic. Marx the prophet was not. Marxists have tried to reconcile the two by insisting that everything that happens is necessarily going to happen when conditions are set, but individuals can hurry the process up by intelligent, ruthless action in the right direction. They do not say whether individuals can turn the dialectic in a different direction so that a completely different goal is eventually reached. It is better for Marxists not to enter upon this problem if they would keep their faith. So don't think about it if you want to stay a Marxist. So that was only half the chapter, holy cow. We've got, I guess they're going deep on this one. So we're going to start section 5 next week. I mean, that was really, really long. Oh, my. Okay, so I got a dog trainer yesterday. Oh, praise God. She says he can be cured. He can be cured of that explosive heart attack inducing barking. Come here, Arturo. Come here. Come here, buddy. It's okay. You want to say hi to the people? Wow. There you go. Look at that guy. He's a little scary, kind of, but he's sweet. Anyway, love you guys. Thank you for coming.